Humanitarian needs are rising across Asia-Pacific, driven by climate disasters, displacement and prolonged crises, even as funding comes under growing pressure. Now, the challenges are in focus ahead of World Humanitarian Day that's coming on August 19, which also honors aid workers operating in increasingly dangerous conditions. Joining us from Kuala Lumpur is Alexander Matheo, IFRC's Regional Director for Asia-Pacific. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us. Humanitarian needs are rising across Asia-Pacific, just as aid budgets are also shrinking. How big is the gap, between what communities need and what the humanitarian system can really deliver right now?
Thank you for having me. I think the answer to your question really depends on which context we are talking about. The perhaps better news is that, yes, aid is declining, but in parts of Asia, it's declining at the same time where national capacity and investment in disaster management is growing, and countries are generally graduating from dependence on aid. So China would be an obvious example, a country that no longer would seek international humanitarian assistance for the crises that it faces. But Indonesia, Vietnam, and other ASEAN countries are also joining that group. But there are extreme examples in Asia-Pacific where that is not the case, and where humanitarian suffering is extreme, where dependence on aid is high, and where the cuts in aid budgets are having consequences on life. So I would put in that list Afghanistan at the top. I was there 3 months ago visiting families who, on the day I had visited, had lost children to cold and hunger. I was in Myanmar last month, and the conditions of people displaced in Sittwe were truly appalling. And Cox's Bazar, the largest refugee camp in the world, is very aid dependent. So cuts in aid have significant impact on rations, access to medical care, and quality of life generally. So for those extreme contexts, the ones we are worried about most in the IFRC, aid cuts are frankly deadly. In other parts of Asia Pacific, it's possible actually that it's about time to change strategy as countries gain their capacity to manage crises independently.
Right. And speaking of consequences, when those funding cuts, reach the ground, what disappears first? Food, healthcare, shelter, preparedness, and who really is being left behind? You mentioned, Afghanistan as one of it as well.
The first strategy of aid organizations when faced with cuts is to cut everything but life-saving aid. So you strip your structures to the absolute minimum. You cut back on any events that are not life-saving or essential to people in crisis. Unfortunately, the cuts are so deep that it doesn't stop there. So in the case of, for example, Afghanistan again, about half of the primary health clinics of the Afghan Red Crescent, supported by the IFRC and its partners, have been cut over the last 12 to 18 months. Now, I visited those clinics and I know that they are the only services available, particularly for women and girls in some of the most remote parts of the country. So when those clinics close, the consequences to people's health and ultimately to their life is dramatic. In Cox's Bazar, the food rations have been cut down to an absolute minimum, not enough. And other basic necessities of life, such as education for the children, is also being cut. So unfortunately, the cuts are very, very significant where people are most dependent on aid. And our absolute priority is to try to make sure that those contexts are not forgotten, that they are supported, and we maintain as many services as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioning firsthand what you saw there itself, Asia-Pacific faces some of the world's biggest climate and disaster risks. Are we really still spending too much on responding after disaster strike rather than really investing earlier in preparedness and prevention?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. That is true now. It has always been true. It is very hard to motivate donors to commit money before a crisis. When the crisis strikes and the images are in the newspapers, that's when the solidarity surges. But in anticipation of a risk that may or may not happen, it's always been harder. The good news is you do see in Asia Pacific, some countries have invested significant amounts of their own money, and it's making a huge difference. So flooding in China is still a risk, but much less of a risk than it was before. because of investment in dams, in flood basins, in drought basins, and all in flood basins. Sorry, in Bangladesh, shelters for during the cyclone season have saved countless lives. Japan, we all know, is as earthquake resistant as any country can be, despite the risk. So there is good news. But on the other hand, Asia is also full of coastal areas and cities that haven't made adequate investment in preparedness, and they are at risk of multiple climate threats, and increasingly, as we just saw in your report, of extreme weather events in terms of extreme heat, which is a relatively new threat and one that we must all be adapting to.
And I was just reading, one of your pieces, and in your June piece on the future of humanitarianism, you actually argue that Asia could play a much bigger role as traditional donors pull back. Is this funding crisis, accelerating a fundamental shift in who really leads humanitarian action?
Well, humanitarian aid, I think, has earned respect and admiration all around the world when it's seen in action in the places that are needed the most. But the global humanitarian system has a major vulnerability, and that is that it's primarily funded by a small handful of donors, most of whom are from North America and Europe. Now, all of those have cut back on financing, which is why we're seeing the biggest contraction of aid in recent history. Now, Asian countries are increasing the amount that they donate. Some are stepping forward and sharing some of the burden of the humanitarian system, but it's still relatively low. So changes in that, in terms of growing commitments to try to sustain a global capacity to respond to people in crisis, wherever they are struck by crisis, Asia can play a huge role. I think from the conversations we're having, it may look a little bit different from an Asian perspective. There may be a bit more south-to-south aid. There may be a bit more sub-regional multilateralism when it comes to deciding how to support each other. But that's fine, as long as ultimately the people in crisis get support, and as long as those crises that are most severe, like Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Cox's Bazar, as long as they are not forgotten, because they need support not just in the short term, but for years and years, sometimes decades.
Absolutely. And you make another interesting point that the traditional humanitarian appeal may not always resonate here in Asia, and that ideas of solidarity and development may really matter more. Does the way the aid sector asks for support need to change?
Well, we're going to have to test that in practice. Certainly, the feedback we have received from partners in Asia within the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and beyond is that there is a need, I would say, for more conversations about how best to express global solidarity for people in crisis. There's a huge and deep tradition of neighborly solidarity, religious solidarity, sometimes regional solidarity, but stretching that further to sharing responsibility for sustaining a refugee camp for 10, 15 years, or supporting a health system in a country that has been broken up by conflict. That is stretching the concept a bit further than it currently exists in some parts of Asia and the Pacific. And so we were advised that we need to have these conversations with governments, with the public, with schools, with universities, with the private sector, about the ways that we really are not helpless in the face of global crises. We can't always solve them, but we can protect life and dignity. And we should all contribute to that. It's a responsibility for all humanity, not just one geographical area.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wonderful insights. Alexander Matheo, he's the Regional Director for Asia Pacific at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies.